In March of 1955, a very old man was lying in a hospital bed in Princeton, New Jersey. He had been brought in the night before with severe abdominal pain. The doctors had told him he had an internal aneurysm, a weakness in a major blood vessel, and that surgery might save him. He declined. He was 76 years old, and he was tired. He told the doctors that it was time. He said he had done what he came to do, and that artificially prolonging life was tasteless. He used that word, tasteless, which sounds strange but was characteristic. He had very strong aesthetic sensibilities, and to him, dying was a natural conclusion to a life, and trying to forestall it by extraordinary medical measures was aesthetically wrong, like holding the final note of a piece of music far past its natural end. The hospital at Princeton was a small, quiet institution in those years, nothing like the vast medical complexes of today. The room where he lay was simply furnished. His secretary, Helen Dukas, had been with him. His son, Hans Albert, had been called and was on his way. His stepdaughter, Margot, was there. The people who had been closest to him in his last years gathered. On the night of April 17th, in the early hours of the morning, a nurse heard him say something in German. She didn't speak German. She couldn't understand the words. A short time later, he was gone. His name was Albert Einstein, and the words nobody caught, the last words ever spoken by one of the greatest minds in human history, dissolved into the darkness of that hospital room and were never recovered. He left behind an unfinished calculation on his bedside table. He had been working on it to the end. The papers were covered in his handwriting, equations and notations, and the particular kind of mathematical exploration that looks, to anyone who doesn't know what they're seeing, like abstract marks on a page. To someone who did know, they were the latest installment of a search that had been going on for 30 years. The search for a unified field theory, a single mathematical framework that would describe all the forces of nature together. He never found it. He died searching for it, the way he had spent most of the last 30 years of his life, convinced that the answer was there, just beyond reach, in the mathematics. The paper was left behind. The bedside table was left behind. The nurse who didn't speak German was left behind, and the world carried on without him, changed entirely by what he had seen and thought and written over the preceding half-century. That's where the story ends. Tonight, we're going to go back to where it begins, to a quiet Sunday afternoon in Munich, Germany, in 1879, when a boy was born who would spend his life asking the simplest possible questions about the universe, and whose answers would shatter almost everything that physics had believed about space, time, matter, energy, gravity, and the nature of reality. It's a long story, a strange story, a story of stubbornness and loneliness and extraordinary insight and surprising warmth and great love and bitter conflict. A story about what it means to see something that nobody else can see and to keep insisting on it, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. And a story, ultimately, about how one human mind, through sustained and almost obsessive concentration, managed to understand the universe better than anyone ever had before. Get comfortable. We're going to go slowly. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. The story will keep until morning. But if you stay with me, I think you'll find that the life of Albert Einstein is one of the most extraordinary things that has ever happened to a person. Let's begin at the very beginning. Hermann Einstein and his wife Pauline Koch were married in 1876. Hermann was a merchant, something of a dreamer, a man who was cheerful and optimistic and not particularly good at business. He had a wonderful sense of humor and a deep love of literature, and he passed both to his son. He was not, by any account, an unhappy man. He took setbacks with equanimity. When businesses failed, which they did more than once, he picked himself up and tried again, usually with his brother Jakob as a partner. He believed things would work out, and they usually did, at least until near the end of his life, when they definitively didn't, and he died in Milan in 1902, with his business affairs in ruins, knowing that he had not provided for his family as he had hoped. Einstein later described his father's death as one of the most profound griefs of his life. The relationship between them had been complicated by Albert's difficult school years and by Hermann's worry about his son's prospects, but the love between them was real. Pauline was sharper, more practical. She was the daughter of a successful corn merchant, and she had both her father's head for business and his love of music. She played the piano with real skill, and she insisted that her children would too. She arranged for Albert to take violin lessons from the age of 6. He initially hated them. The lessons were dry and mechanical, focused on technical exercises rather than music. He went through the motions without enjoyment. Then, at around 13, he discovered Mozart, something unlocked. He heard the clarity and mathematical precision of the sonatas and understood them as music rather than as exercises. He began to practice voluntarily. He played for pleasure. He would remain an amateur violinist for the rest of his life, but music became one of the things he genuinely loved, a companion through all the loneliness and difficulty that lay ahead. He played with colleagues and friends everywhere he lived. He performed at charity concerts. He once said that if he had not been a physicist, he would have been a musician. He said that, in a sense, he was both, because the work of physics was a form of music, the same underlying drive toward pattern and beauty. They were a Jewish family, secular in their practice, assimilated into German bourgeois society in the way that many Jewish families of their era were, having put aside strict religious observance in favor of the comfortable, cultured life of the educated German middle class. They didn't keep kosher. They observed major holidays but without intensity. They thought of themselves as Germans who happened to be Jewish, not as a community apart. This self-understanding, comfortable and confident in 1879, would be shattered within Albert's lifetime. They were living in the city of Ulm, in Württemberg, in southern Germany, when their first child was born, on the 14th of March, 1879. They named him Albert. Pauline was immediately worried about the back of Albert's head. It seemed to her misshapen, too large on one side. She called for the doctor. The doctor examined the child and told her there was nothing wrong. The shape of the head was normal. Pauline relaxed. The head that would eventually contain the most celebrated scientific mind of the 20th century had made its first impression, slightly alarming, but fine on inspection. The Einstein family moved to Munich when Albert was 15 months old. Hermann had gone into business with his brother Jakob, running an electro-technical company. Munich was a more promising city for business than Ulm, and the brothers set up their firm there, manufacturing electrical equipment, eventually installing some of the first electric lighting in various Munich locations. The firm was genuinely innovative, and they were genuinely good engineers. The business problem was not technical, it was financial. They were chronically undercapitalized, unable to invest enough to compete with larger, better-funded companies. But in Albert's childhood years, the Munich house was comfortable and full of life. The family had a garden. Albert's sister Maria, called Maya, was born in 1881, 2.5 years after Albert. The two siblings were close from childhood and remained close their whole lives. There are photographs of them as children that show a similarity. The same dark eyes, the same quality of attention in the gaze, looking at the camera, with an expression that is neither smile nor frown, but just a kind of calm assessment. Albert grew up in a household that was comfortable and warm. He was, by his own later account, a solitary child, given to long periods of private thought. He was not socially forward. He was not the kind of child who immediately draws people to him. He was quiet, a little dreamy, with a tendency to withdraw from the company of other children into his own inner world. His parents sometimes worried about this. He was also, unusually for the time and place, slow to begin talking. He did not speak his first words until he was 2 or 3 years old, much later than other children. Once he did start talking, he developed the habit of repeating his sentences to himself quietly under his breath, as if verifying them, a habit he maintained for several years and that disappeared eventually without explanation. His sister Maja later recalled this as one of the things that had most struck her about him as a child. Albert had a younger sister named Maja. The two were inseparable for much of their childhood. He read to her. He explained things to her. He was, in his way, a devoted older brother, and their relationship carried something of the quality of a friendship between intellectual equals, even in childhood. When Albert struggled with the social isolation that came from his unconventional nature and his difficulty with rote learning, Maja was a constant companion. There is a story that Einstein told many times in his later life about the moment he felt wonder for the first time. He was sick in bed, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, and his father brought him a small pocket compass to play with. Albert held it in his hands and watched the needle. No matter which way he turned the compass, the needle swiveled to point in the same direction. Something was acting on that needle, something invisible, something that reached through empty space and exerted a force. Something that he could not see and could not touch was making that needle move. He later said that this experience shook him to his core, that the memory of that compass and the feeling of astonishment it produced never entirely left him. And you can see in that small episode the whole shape of his future, a child who encounters something that defies simple explanation, and instead of dismissing it or accepting it as ordinary, is shaken, is disturbed, is compelled to ask why. That quality, that refusal to let the wonder go, to keep pressing the question, was what made Einstein Einstein. He was not, contrary to popular myth, a poor student. The myth that Einstein failed mathematics at school is false and needs to be corrected whenever it circulates. He was good at mathematics and physics from an early age, one of the best in his class. What he was bad at was rote learning. He had no patience for memorizing facts that seemed to him arbitrary or unjustified. He wanted to understand things, not merely to repeat them. In the German gymnasium, the academic secondary school, this disposition made him not a failure, but a difficult and sometimes disruptive student. He chafed against the authoritarian teaching style of German education in that era. The expectation that students would absorb information passively and regurgitate it on demand was, to Einstein, precisely the wrong way to learn anything worth knowing. He had a particular hatred of a teacher who apparently resented his habit of asking inconvenient questions. There's a story, which may or may not be entirely accurate but captures something true, in which this teacher told the young Einstein that he would never amount to anything. Einstein later said it was this teacher who had no influence on him at all, because his dislike of the man was so complete that it was liberating. 2 influences on Einstein's intellectual development in these early years are worth knowing about. The first was a young medical student named Max Talmud, who began visiting the Einstein household for weekly dinners when Albert was about 10 years old. This was a tradition in many Jewish families, to invite a poor student to share the family meal. Talmud was interested in science and philosophy, and he brought books for Albert. He brought popular science books about physics. He brought the works of Immanuel Kant and other philosophers. He brought Aaron Bernstein's multi-volume popular books on natural science, which Albert devoured. Albert read them all. He and Talmud would talk for hours about what he had read. Talmud later recalled that Albert quickly outpaced him, that within a year or two the boy was asking questions that Talmud couldn't answer, and thinking about physics in ways that Talmud found startling. The teacher had become the student. Talmud stepped back from the tutorials not because Albert had stopped being interested, but because there was nothing more he could offer. The second influence was a geometry textbook. When Albert was around 12 years old, he received a textbook on Euclidean geometry, and he fell in love with it. He called it, later in life, his sacred little geometry book. What he loved about it was the certainty. Here were propositions that could be demonstrated to be necessarily true, not just probably true, not just observed to be true, but proven, logically, inescapably, from first principles. You started with a small number of definitions and axioms. You applied the rules of logical deduction. You arrived at theorems that had to be true, that could not be false, given the starting assumptions. The whole vast edifice of Euclidean geometry followed from a handful of simple statements. This was unlike anything else Albert had encountered. In the ordinary world, things were true or false depending on observation, on experiment, on checking. You measured something to find out what it was. But in geometry, you reasoned your way to the answer. You didn't need to measure whether the interior angles of a triangle added up to 180 degrees. You proved it. The certainty was rational, not empirical. This fascination with the power of pure reason to arrive at necessary truth never left him. It shaped his whole approach to physics. He believed that the correct physical theories should have a quality of logical inevitability, a feeling that they could not have been otherwise. He believed that you could, in principle, derive the correct theory of the universe by thinking hard enough, because the universe had to be internally consistent, and internal consistency was something you could reason about. This conviction served him extraordinarily well in developing special and general relativity, where the key was precisely to ask what must be true for the laws of physics to be consistent. It served him less well in his later resistance to quantum mechanics, where the universe simply did not feel the obligation to be comprehensible in the way he required. By the time he was 12, Albert Einstein had read through most of the standard curriculum in mathematics on his own, out of curiosity. He was teaching himself calculus before his teachers got to it. He was asking about the foundations of mechanics, about what Newton's laws were actually saying about the nature of motion, about what it would mean to travel alongside a beam of light. That last question would take him 15 years to answer. The answer, when it came, would be one of the most transformative ideas in the history of human thought. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. When Albert was 15, the family moved again. Hermann and Jakob's Munich electrical business had struggled, unable to compete with larger companies, and they had decided to try their luck in Italy, where there was a large infrastructure contract available. They moved to Milan. They enrolled Albert back in Munich to finish his schooling, living in a boarding house, separated from his family for the first time. He hated it. He was miserable. He found the boarding house dreary and the school system oppressive. He missed his family. He lasted about 6 months. He then did something that was either bold or reckless, depending on how you look at it. He persuaded a doctor to give him a certificate, stating that he was suffering from nervous exhaustion and required rest. He also somehow convinced his mathematics teacher to write a letter confirming that he had already mastered the mathematics curriculum. Armed with these two documents, he withdrew from the Munich gymnasium and moved to Milan to join his family, without having finished his degree. His father was not pleased. Hermann had assumed that Albert would eventually take over the family business or go into electrical engineering. An incomplete gymnasium degree was not the right foundation. There were conversations about Albert's future, conversations that were more difficult than either of them probably wanted. Albert insisted he knew what he was doing. He wanted to study physics. He wanted to go to university. He applied to the Zurich Polytechnic, known as the ETH, one of the leading technical universities in Europe. He was 16, 2 years younger than the usual admissions age. He took the entrance examination and failed it. Not in mathematics and physics, in which he performed brilliantly, but in French and botany and other subjects outside his focused interests. The director of the ETH, impressed by the mathematics scores, suggested he spend a year at the cantonal school in Aarau, Switzerland, complete his secondary education properly, and apply again. Einstein spent the year in Aarau, and it transformed him. The Swiss school system was, in his experience, the opposite of the German one. The teaching style was Socratic and liberal. Students were encouraged to think for themselves, to question, to understand rather than memorize. He boarded with the family of one of his teachers, Jost Winteler, and became almost like one of the family. He played violin with them in the evenings. He went on long walks in the Swiss countryside. He fell in love with one of the Winteler daughters, Marie, his first serious romantic attachment. He was, for the first time in his schooling, genuinely happy. He was also, during this year, thinking more systematically than ever before about the question that had been gathering in him since early adolescence. What would it feel like to ride alongside a beam of light? He was 17 years old, and the question had been with him for at least 2 or 3 years. It was not a casual thought. It was a thought he had been turning over continuously, testing it against the physics he knew, finding that it produced a contradiction he couldn't resolve. The contradiction was this. Classical physics, Newton's mechanics, said that velocities added together in the obvious way. If you were traveling at 90% of the speed of light and you shone a flashlight forward, the light should travel at 10% of the speed of light relative to you, and the full speed of light relative to a stationary observer. That was the classical rule. Velocities add up. But Maxwell's equations, which described electromagnetism and light, said something different. They said light always traveled at a specific speed, 300,000 kilometers per second, not relative to any medium, not relative to any particular observer, just 300,000 kilometers per second, period. The equations didn't have any provision for the speed of light being different for different observers. So if you traveled at 90% of the speed of light and shone a light forward, what happened? If Maxwell was right, the light still traveled at 300,000 kilometers per second, not at 10% of that, at the full speed, which meant that you, traveling at 90% of the speed of light, were not getting any closer to the beam of light. The gap between you and the light ahead of you was not shrinking. The light was still outrunning you by 300,000 kilometers per second, as if you weren't moving at all. And if you were traveling at the full speed of light, you would see a frozen electromagnetic wave beside you. Light that wasn't moving. But Maxwell's equations didn't allow for a static electromagnetic wave. The wave had to be oscillating, had to be changing, had to be moving. A frozen light wave was a physical impossibility, according to the equations. Something was wrong. Either Newton was wrong, or Maxwell was wrong, or there was some deeper framework that unified them and showed where each was limited. Einstein held this question for 10 years, without fully resolving it. It was the central puzzle of his intellectual life during his 20s. He later described this period as one of great psychic tension. The question was always present. It colored everything else. When he worked at the patent office and thought about physics in the evenings, this was often what he was thinking about, circling it, trying different approaches, finding that none of them quite worked. He read everything relevant. He read the work of Hendrik Lorentz, the Dutch physicist who had derived mathematical transformations that correctly described how measurements changed for observers in motion, but who had done so using a physical model, the luminiferous ether, that Einstein found unconvincing. He read the work of Henri Poincaré, the French mathematician who had come close to the key insight but had not fully taken the step. He read Ernst Mach, the Austrian philosopher and physicist, who had argued that absolute space and absolute time were meaningless concepts. These readings fed into his thinking without resolving it. The resolution, when it finally came through a conversation. The famous Bern walk with Besso, in May of 1905. Einstein had been stuck. He had been trying to hold on to both Newtonian mechanics and Maxwell's equations simultaneously, trying to find some modification of one or the other that would make them consistent. Nothing worked. In the conversation with Besso, walking through the streets of Bern, he articulated the problem aloud one more time, and something clicked. The problem was not in Newtonian mechanics or Maxwell's equations themselves. The problem was in a hidden assumption that both shared. The assumption that time was absolute, that there was a universal now, that two events were either simultaneous or they weren't, and this was a fact independent of who was observing them. He went home and slept. He woke up knowing the answer. He passed the entrance examination to the ETH in 1895, spent a year in Aarau, and then began his studies at the ETH in Zurich in October of 1896, at the age of 17, after receiving a perfect score in mathematics and physics on the entrance examination. The ETH years were productive and complicated. Einstein made deep, lasting friendships. He met Marcel Grossmann, who would become his closest mathematical collaborator, and who would decades later provide the mathematical tools Einstein needed to formulate general relativity. Grossmann was methodical where Einstein was intuitive, precise where Einstein was inspired. Their friendship was one of the most important intellectual partnerships in the history of physics, even though Grossmann's name appears in far fewer popular accounts than it deserves. He met Michele Besso, an Italian-Swiss engineer who became his best friend for life, the person Einstein could think out loud with, the sounding board, who helped him work through difficulties, not by solving them, but by asking the right questions. Einstein later said that he could not have made his crucial breakthrough on special relativity without the daily conversations he had with Besso in the weeks before. He met Mileva Marić, a Serbian physicist, and the only woman in his physics cohort at the ETH, with whom he fell deeply and passionately in love. Mileva was, by any account, an exceptional person. She had overcome enormous obstacles to reach the ETH. Women were not easily admitted to technical universities in that era, and she had persisted through rejections and detours to get there. She was serious, studious, quiet in her way, and deeply interested in physics. Einstein's early letters to her, which survive and have been extensively studied by historians, reveal a relationship of genuine intellectual equality. He called her his little street urchin and doxeral, terms of rough affection. He wrote to her about physics with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything. He told her his ideas before he told anyone else. The nature of Mileva's intellectual contribution to Einstein's work has been debated by scholars for decades. Some have argued that she was effectively a collaborator on the 1905 papers and deserves some credit. Others argue that the letters don't support this view, and that she was primarily a sounding board and an emotional support. The evidence is ambiguous. What seems clear is that in the early years, the relationship was one of genuine intellectual partnership and intense romantic attachment, and that this combination meant something significant to a young man who was used to being intellectually isolated. His relationship with his professors was more fraught. He had a habit, which he was unable or unwilling to suppress, of skipping lectures that he found uninteresting and reading the material himself. He relied heavily on Grossmann's meticulous lecture notes to catch up before examinations. His main physics professor, Heinrich Weber, eventually grew so frustrated with Einstein's unconventional habits that he told him directly that the young man was clever, but that his inability to accept authority would prevent him from getting anywhere. Einstein later said that Weber had never called him Herr Einstein, which was the respectful form of address, but always Herr Einstein, in the same tone one might use to address a misbehaving schoolboy. There was also a specific incident that Einstein found painful. In the final year of his studies, students at the ETH who excelled were typically invited to stay on as assistants to their professors. It was the standard path into an academic career. Einstein expected to be offered such a position. He was not. Weber gave the assistantship to someone else. Einstein later believed that Weber had deliberately blocked his path into academic science, motivated by personal dislike. Whether or not this is accurate, the effect was real. He graduated without the academic connection that would normally ease the transition into scientific work. Einstein graduated from the ETH in 1900, not with distinction, but adequately. And then came two of the most difficult years of his life. He could not find a job. He applied for teaching positions at the ETH and at other universities. He applied repeatedly. Nobody would hire him. His former professors, including Weber, did not support his applications. A young graduate with no publications, mediocre grades by official record, and a reputation for unconventional behavior was not an attractive prospect. Einstein was, in these years, genuinely worried. He was supporting himself by tutoring students and taking temporary positions, borrowing money from family when necessary. He and Mileva were in love and spoke of marrying, but his father Hermann refused to give his blessing. He thought Mileva was an unsuitable choice. She was older than Albert, Serbian, and not of their social milieu. Hermann was not a cruel man. He was acting on the conventions of his time and class, but his refusal caused real pain. Mileva became pregnant in 1901. The child, a daughter they named Lieserl, was born in January of 1902 in Serbia, where Mileva had gone to stay with her parents. Lieserl never appears in the historical record after the first months of her life. She is mentioned in letters between Albert and Mileva, and then she is simply gone. What happened to her is unknown. She was apparently either given up for adoption, perhaps to a family friend in Serbia, or she died in infancy, possibly from scarlet fever, which was mentioned in one of the letters as affecting her. Einstein never publicly acknowledged her existence. No mention of her appears in any of his public writings or in the autobiographies and interviews he gave throughout his long public life. It is one of the silences in his biography that no amount of subsequent scholarship has fully filled. A child was born, his first child, and she disappeared, and he said nothing. The reasons were presumably practical. The stigma of illegitimacy, the impossibility of supporting a family on no income, the social pressures of the era. The emotional weight of it is impossible to assess from outside. What we can say is that the loss, whatever form it took, was real, and that Mileva carried it particularly hard. He applied for teaching positions at the ETH and at other universities. He applied repeatedly. Nobody would hire him. The professional breakthrough came in 1902, through the good offices of Marcel Grossmann, whose father knew the director of the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. A position was available as a technical examiner, level 3, evaluating patent applications. The work was not glamorous. It was not scientific research, but it was steady, well-paid, respectable employment, and Einstein took it with relief. He later described getting the position as one of the best things that ever happened to him, and he meant it, without irony. He and Mileva married in January of 1903. They settled in Bern in a modest apartment. In the early years, the household was warm and intellectually lively. Their first surviving son, Hans Albert, was born in 1904. A second son, Eduard, came later. Mileva was not entirely happy in Bern, separated from her own family and away from the academic world. She had hoped to be a physicist and had been thwarted by a combination of circumstance and the barriers that women scientists faced in that era. These disappointments accumulated quietly, but Albert, in those years, was as close to happy as he would be for a long time. He had security, he had family, and he had his evenings. The patent office work suited him in a way that is worth thinking about carefully. He was evaluating applications for mechanical and electrical devices, assessing whether claimed inventions were novel and whether the descriptions were accurate. This required both technical competence and clear conceptual thinking. You had to understand what the inventor was trying to do and assess whether the mechanism described actually accomplished it. It was, in a modest way, a daily practice in the same skill that physics required. And crucially, the work was finite. At the end of the day, it was done. Einstein's mind was free in a way that no academic position would have allowed. An academic physicist spent his evenings writing lectures, reviewing papers, advising students, attending committees. The patent office gave him his time back. The patent office years, 1902 to 1909, were the most scientifically productive years of Einstein's life. Possibly the most productive years any physicist has ever had. Let me explain how this was possible. The patent examiner's work was technically demanding, but left his mind substantially free. He evaluated applications, wrote up assessments, went home. There was no demand on him to publish, to teach, to network, to perform the social rituals of academic science. He had evenings and weekends entirely to himself. He and Mileva married in January of 1903 and soon established a household that, in those early years, was warm and intellectually lively. Their first surviving son, Hans Albert, was born in 1904. A second son, Eduard, came later. In those evening hours, at the table after dinner, or in his small study, with the sounds of the household around him, Einstein worked on physics. He wrote letters to Besso and Grossmann. He thought, he read, he turned ideas over in his mind with a methodical intensity that he likened to physical labor, to hammering at a problem the way a craftsman hammers at a piece of metal, not knowing where the blow will fall, but keeping at it until the shape begins to emerge. The year 1905 is known in the history of physics as Einstein's annus mirabilis, his miracle year. In that single year, Einstein published 4 papers. Each one of them was a masterpiece. Any one of them could have established a permanent reputation. Together, they transformed physics. But before we talk about the papers themselves, let me say something about the conditions under which they were written, because I think the circumstances matter. Einstein was 26 years old. He was a patent examiner in the Swiss federal city of Bern, a pleasant medieval town with covered arcades along its main street and the famous clock tower, the Zietglocke, that still marks the center of the old city. He and Mileva lived in a modest apartment. He worked at the patent office 6 days a week. He did science in the evenings and on Sundays. He had no laboratory. He had no research budget. He had no graduate students to discuss his ideas with, except for the conversations with Besso. What he had was time. Specifically, he had mental time. The patent office work, while intellectually demanding in its own way, did not consume the entire capacity of his mind. He was able to compartmentalize with unusual effectiveness, and the hours at his desk, evaluating patent applications, left a reserve of mental energy that he directed, every evening, at the physics problems that had been accumulating in his mind for years. He also had something rarer. He had cultivated, deliberately and consciously, the ability to think in images rather than just in equations. He called these thought experiments Gedankenexperimente in German, and they were his primary tool. Before he wrote an equation, he would imagine a physical situation vividly, concretely, in his mind. A person falling in an elevator, a train moving past a platform, a beam of light being chased. He would ask what such a person would see, what such an observer would measure, and only then would he look for the mathematics that described what he had imagined. This approach, thinking first in physical intuition and then translating into mathematics, was the opposite of the approach most theoretical physicists used. It was unusual and, in his hands, spectacularly effective. The first paper proposed that light came in discrete packets of energy, quanta, a concept that Planck had introduced in 1900, but which Einstein was the first to take seriously as a real physical statement about the nature of light, rather than a mathematical trick. Einstein applied this idea to explain the photoelectric effect, the phenomenon by which light falling on metal surfaces ejects electrons. The explanation required the assumption that light was quantized, that it came in photons. This paper, for which Einstein would eventually receive the Nobel Prize in 1921, was one of the founding documents of quantum mechanics. The second paper was on Brownian motion, the observation made by botanist Robert Brown in 1827 that pollen grains suspended in water moved in a random, jittery way that had no obvious cause. Einstein showed that this motion was produced by the statistical buffeting of water molecules, and he worked out the exact mathematical relationship between the observed motion and the properties of the molecules. It was the most direct and convincing evidence yet provided that atoms and molecules were real physical objects, and not just convenient mathematical fictions. Some leading physicists of the era still doubted the reality of atoms. After Einstein's Brownian motion paper, that doubt became essentially untenable. The third paper was the one that made his name. It was titled, with deceptive modesty, On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies. It contained the special theory of relativity. Let me walk through this more slowly, because the idea deserves care. The question Einstein had been carrying since he was a teenager, what would it be like to travel alongside a beam of light, had been transformed over the years into a sharper and more tractable form. He had understood that the question pointed to a contradiction between two great pillars of physics. On one side, Newton's mechanics, which included a rule for how velocities added together. If you were on a train moving at 60 kilometers per hour and you threw a ball forward at 10 kilometers per hour, the ball moved at 70 kilometers per hour relative to the ground. Simple addition. On the other side, Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism, which predicted a specific, fixed speed for light, approximately 300,000 kilometers per second. They didn't say this was the speed of light relative to some medium or some privileged reference frame. They just said this was the speed of light, period, for any observer. If both were right, you got paradoxes. A person moving at half the speed of light and shining a torch forward should see the light leaving them at 300,000 kilometers per second, relative to them. But a stationary observer should see that same light moving at 300,000 plus 150,000, which is 450,000 kilometers per second. They can't both be right. Either the light travels at different speeds for different observers, or Newton's velocity addition rule breaks down. For 10 years, Einstein thought about this. He later recalled that what finally broke the deadlock was a conversation with Besso, one of his walking conversations through the streets of Bern. He had been stuck. He had been trying various approaches, and none of them worked. And then, in the course of the conversation, the key insight came. The problem was in the concept of time itself. Specifically, in the concept of simultaneity. Physicists had assumed that two events were either simultaneous or they weren't, and that this was an absolute fact, independent of who was measuring it. Einstein realized this assumption was wrong. There is no such thing as absolute simultaneity. Whether two events happen at the same time depends on the state of motion of the observer. Two events that are simultaneous for someone standing still are not necessarily simultaneous for someone moving, and once you give up absolute simultaneity, everything else follows. Moving clocks tick slowly. Moving rulers are shorter. Moving masses are greater, and the speed of light is the same for everyone. He went home from that walk and wrote the paper in 5 weeks. The fourth paper of 1905, a short addendum to the Relativity paper, derived the most famous equation in the history of science. E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. The equation followed directly from special relativity. If the speed of light was the same for all observers, then mass and energy were equivalent. They were the same thing in different forms. A small amount of mass contained an enormous amount of energy because the conversion factor was the square of the speed of light, an enormous number. The equation described nuclear weapons and nuclear power, and PET scanners, and the energy output of stars and 100 other things before anyone had any practical use for any of them. 4 papers in a single year, each one a revolution. Written by a 26-year-old patent examiner with no academic position, no research funding, no laboratory, no graduate students, and no access to the kind of institutional support that normally surrounds scientific breakthrough. Einstein sent his papers to the Annalen der Physik, a prestigious German physics journal. He did not know if they would be accepted or read or understood. He was, after all, a nobody. He had no reputation. He was not a member of any academic institution. He was just a man who had thought very hard about some problems and written down his thoughts. The papers were accepted, and then, slowly, the physics world began to read them. The response was not immediate. Relativity, in particular, was difficult. The ideas were unfamiliar. The notation was unusual. Some physicists read the paper and were baffled. Others read it and were thrilled. Max Planck, who was at Berlin and was the editor of the journal, read the paper carefully and saw immediately that it was something extraordinary. He began to champion it. Slowly, over the next couple of years, word spread. The young patent examiner in Bern had done something remarkable. By 1908, Einstein had his first academic invitation. He was offered a position as an unpaid lecturer at the University of Bern. The position was called Privatdozent, meaning private lecturer, and it was the lowest rung of the German academic ladder. The lecturer charged fees directly to students who attended the lectures. There were, initially, very few students in Einstein's courses. He later recalled that for a time, his only regular student was his friend Besso. But the recognition was coming. In 1909, he was offered a full professorship at the University of Zurich. He accepted. He left the patent office. After 7 years of examining applications and thinking on his own time, he joined the world of academic physics. He was 30 years old, and he was about to embark on the most sustained and difficult scientific effort of his career. Special relativity had described the physics of objects moving at constant velocity, but it said nothing about acceleration. It said nothing about gravity. And Einstein had noticed something that would take him 10 years to fully understand. He called it the happiest thought of his life. He was sitting in his chair in the patent office one day, and a thought came to him. If a person is falling freely, they feel no gravity. Think of an astronaut in orbit. The astronaut is falling toward Earth at exactly the right speed and direction, that the fall equals the forward motion, producing orbit. They float. They feel weightless. The gravitational force acting on them is not felt. Now think of it in reverse. If you're in a rocket accelerating upward, the floor pushes against your feet. You feel a force. If the rocket accelerates at exactly 9.8 meters per second squared, the same as Earth's gravitational acceleration, you feel exactly what you'd feel standing on Earth's surface. You cannot tell, from inside the rocket, whether you're in a gravitational field or accelerating. This is the equivalence principle. Gravity and acceleration are locally equivalent. You cannot distinguish them from inside a small enclosed space. Einstein saw immediately that this was profound. It meant that gravity was not just a force like other forces. It was something else. Something geometric, something connected to the very nature of space and time. He spent 10 years working out what that something was, and the 10 years were genuinely agonizing, in ways that are worth dwelling on. In 1907, Einstein wrote a review article on special relativity and included a brief, almost offhand treatment of gravity and acceleration, outlining the equivalence principle. He recognized immediately that there was much more to say, but he didn't yet know how to say it. The mathematics required went far beyond anything he had learned at the ETH. He needed the mathematics of curved surfaces in multiple dimensions, a field called Riemannian geometry, named for the 19th century mathematician Bernhard Riemann, who had developed it in the 1850s as pure mathematics with no physical application in mind. Riemann had asked the question, what would geometry look like on a curved surface, and how would you generalize this to spaces of more than 2 dimensions? He had answered the question with extraordinary elegance and generality, producing a mathematical framework of great power. It had been sitting in the mathematical literature for 50 years, essentially unused by physicists, waiting for a physical problem that needed it. Einstein didn't know this mathematics. He had to learn it, and learning it as a professional physicist while working full-time as a professor was extremely difficult. He called on Marcel Grossmann, who had by then become a professor of mathematics at the ETH. Grossmann, who had once saved Einstein's academic skin by lending him his lecture notes, now saved his scientific life by teaching him the mathematical tools he needed. They collaborated on a joint paper in 1913, the Entwurf theory, which was a first attempt at a relativistic theory of gravity. It was wrong. Einstein would recognize this over the next 2 years and have to start over. He was also receiving help from nobody. The problem was so unfamiliar, so far from the mainstream of physics, that almost no one else was working on it. He was essentially alone with a problem of extraordinary difficulty, using mathematics he was only partially master of, trying to express physical intuitions that he couldn't fully translate into equations. He later described this period as one of great inner struggle, of painful searching in the dark. He moved to Berlin in 1914, having accepted a prestigious position at the Prussian Academy of Sciences that came without teaching obligations, giving him full time to work on physics. The move meant separating from Mileva, who returned to Zurich with the two boys. The marriage was effectively over, though the formal separation and divorce would take several more years. In Berlin, Einstein worked with new intensity. He had colleagues at last, physicists like Max Planck, who could discuss his ideas at the level they deserved. He was close to David Hilbert, the greatest mathematician of the era, who was also working on the problem of a relativistic theory of gravity, and who nearly beat Einstein to the finish line. In November of 1915, Einstein and Hilbert were in close contact, comparing notes, and there was a period of just a few weeks when it was not clear who would complete the theory first. Einstein got there first, publishing the final field equations in late November 1915. The relationship between Einstein and Hilbert about who deserved priority for what was complicated and has been debated by historians, but the physics community has always recognized the theory as Einstein's. But what strikes me most about this period is not the competition with Hilbert, it's the personal circumstances. Einstein was in Berlin. His wife and children were in Zurich. The marriage was effectively over, though the legal proceedings would take years. He was living alone for the first time, in an apartment he found bare and depressing, not eating properly, not sleeping enough, driven by the physics to a state of intensity that his friends worried about. Ehrenfest, visiting him in Berlin around 1915, found him thin and distracted, and simultaneously more intellectually alive than anyone Ehrenfest had ever seen. Einstein later said he didn't know how he would have survived those years without the physics, without the consuming demands of the problem that had occupied him for 10 years and that was finally giving way. The development of the final field equations took place over 4 weeks of November 1915 in a state of furious concentration. Einstein was giving weekly lectures at the Prussian Academy, presenting the theory in installments, and the theory was changing from week to week as he worked through the mathematics. He published 4 papers in those 4 weeks, each one correcting or extending the previous one. The 4th paper, published on November 25, 1915, contained the final form of the field equations. They were correct. They remained unchanged for the next century, and are still the equations used in every application of general relativity today. He calculated the precession of Mercury's orbit. The orbit of Mercury had an anomaly, a slow rotation of the orbit's axis that could not be explained by Newtonian mechanics. Various explanations had been proposed, including the existence of an undiscovered planet inside Mercury's orbit, but none had been confirmed. Einstein's field equations predicted the anomaly exactly, not approximately, exactly. He knew immediately that this was an independent confirmation that the theory was correct. He was so shaken by the calculation, by the sudden perfect match between his equations and an observation that had been puzzling astronomers for decades, that he had heart palpitations and could not work for 3 days. He wrote to Ehrenfest that he was out of his mind with joy. He had shown that gravity was the curvature of space-time. Mass and energy curved the 4-dimensional fabric of space and time around them, and other objects moved through that curved space-time, following the straightest possible paths, what mathematicians call geodesics. What we experience as gravitational attraction is not a force pulling us toward the Earth. It is us following the curved geometry of spacetime that the Earth's mass has created. The planets don't orbit the Sun because the Sun is pulling them. They follow the natural geodesics of the curved spacetime that the Sun creates. The equations he wrote down, the Einstein field equations, were among the most compact and elegant expressions of physical law ever written. On one side of the equation, a description of the geometry of spacetime. On the other side, a description of the matter and energy content. The equation says that matter tells spacetime how to curve, and curved spacetime tells matter how to move. It's a dynamic, self-consistent loop. Geometry and physics inseparable. Einstein later recalled that when he held the final equations in his hands, he was so overcome that he could not work for 3 days. He had heart palpitations. He felt that he had seen something true, not just useful, not just approximately correct, something true. He calculated an immediate prediction. The equations predicted that starlight passing close to the Sun should be deflected by the Sun's gravity, not just a little, but twice as much as classical Newtonian gravity predicted. He also calculated that the orbit of Mercury, which had a tiny unexplained deviation from the Newtonian prediction, was explained perfectly by his equations. When he made the Mercury calculation and it came out right, he later said, he was so excited he couldn't sleep for 3 nights. His heart was pounding. Something had clicked into place. The starlight deflection test would have to wait for a suitable eclipse. The next good opportunity was a total solar eclipse in May of 1919. In the meantime, the First World War had engulfed Europe. The eclipse expedition of 1919 was led by the British astronomer Arthur Eddington, who had been persuaded by the astronomer Frank Dyson to organize a test of Einstein's theory. Eddington was a Quaker and had avoided military service as a conscientious objector. He was deeply attracted to Einstein's theory and was personally invested in confirming it. 2 expeditions were organized, one to the island of Príncipe, off the coast of West Africa, and one to Sobral in Brazil, to observe the eclipse from the best available locations. There's a story about Eddington and the eclipse that captures the human drama of science. Someone apparently said to him that he must be one of only 3 people in the world who truly understood general relativity. Eddington paused and said he was trying to think who the third was. The story may be apocryphal, but it points to something real. In 1919, the number of physicists who had genuinely worked through the mathematics of general relativity was tiny. It was a theory that had been published by a German physicist during the war, in a country that Britain had been fighting for 4 years. The fact that British scientists were willing to organize and fund an expedition to test a German theory, and that an anti-war British scientist of Quaker faith was leading the effort, is itself part of the story. Science, and specifically science done in the spirit of internationalism, was going to triumph over the ugliness of recent history. At least that was the hope. The night before the eclipse on Príncipe, it rained. Eddington was anxious. The next morning, clouds covered the sky. Slowly, as the eclipse began, the clouds parted slightly. Not entirely, but enough. Eddington got some plates. Back in England, as the plates were analyzed, the measurements were compared to Einstein's prediction and to the Newtonian prediction. The uncertainties were not trivial. The 1919 results have been subjected to extensive historical and statistical scrutiny, and some historians have concluded that Eddington was less than fully objective in how he weighted the plates, selecting those that agreed with Einstein's prediction and discounting those that didn't. Whether or not this criticism is fully fair, The subsequent 40 years of eclipse measurements and other tests have thoroughly confirmed the prediction. The 1919 result was right, even if the method of arriving at it was somewhat rough. The announcement came on November 6, 1919, at a joint meeting of the Royal Society and the Royal Astronomical Society in London. J.J. Thomson, the president of the Royal Society and the discoverer of the electron, presided. The room was full. The expectation in the air was intense. Thomson made the announcement from the podium. He said that the results confirmed Einstein's theory and that it was one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest, achievements in human thought. He compared Einstein's field equations to the carved stone tablets in the background, which bore the equations of electromagnetism written by Maxwell. He said Newton had been superseded. The newspapers picked it up the next day. The headline in the London Times read, "Revolution in Science, New Theory of the Universe. Newton's Ideas Overthrown." The New York Times sent a correspondent to interview Einstein. Other papers around the world followed. Einstein became famous overnight. Not just famous among scientists, famous everywhere. His face appeared on newspaper front pages. Cartoons depicted him. Streets were named after him. He received thousands of letters. He became, at the age of 40, perhaps the most famous living scientist in the world, and arguably the most famous intellectual of the 20th century. He was uncomfortable with the fame from the beginning. He found the attention excessive and the celebrity culture bewildering. He made jokes about it with characteristic irony. He performed for the cameras with a winking awareness of his own absurdity. He was photographed endlessly, with his wild white hair, eventually, and his rumpled clothes and his pipe, and he seemed simultaneously amused by and resigned to the role he was now expected to play. He wrote to a friend shortly after the November announcement that since the deluge of attention began, he had been so inundated with questions and correspondence that he could barely breathe, let alone think. He had become, he said, something of a mythological figure, and he wasn't quite sure how to relate to the myth, since he was just a person who liked to think about physics. But he was also genuinely moved by the validation. He had spent years working in isolation on ideas that might have been wrong, and the confirmation was real. The universe had turned out to be the way he thought it was. That mattered deeply. His personal life was being reorganized around the same time. He had divorced Mileva in 1919, after years of painful and difficult negotiation. The divorce settlement had been carefully worked out over letters and through intermediaries. Mileva received custody of their 2 sons, Hans Albert and Eduard. She was to receive regular financial support, and Einstein had promised, somewhat remarkably, that if he ever won the Nobel Prize, he would give her the prize money. This was not just generosity, it was strategy. He was confident enough of the Nobel to use it as a concrete financial commitment. He was right. When the prize came in 1921, the money went to Mileva. In June of 1919, shortly after the divorce was finalized, he married Elsa, his cousin. The relationship had developed gradually through the Berlin years, and Elsa had become his closest companion and emotional anchor through the difficult period of the war and the completion of general relativity. Elsa Einstein is often undervalued in accounts of Einstein's life. She was warm, practical, socially adept in ways that Albert never was. She managed the household and the correspondence and the social obligations that the famous Einstein generated. She shielded him from demands on his time. She made the life possible. She loved him, and she accepted the complexity of loving him, which was considerable. He was not an easy man to be married to. He was absent-minded in domestic matters, capable of working through mealtimes without noticing, capable of talking so long with a visiting physicist that Elsa had to remind him there were other guests waiting. He had other emotional entanglements throughout their marriage that she presumably knew about and tolerated. But the partnership worked, in its way, and Elsa gave him stability during some of the most externally turbulent years of his life. She died in 1936 after a period of illness, and Einstein was genuinely bereft in a way that surprised him. He had not expected to be so affected, or perhaps he had not allowed himself to acknowledge how much she meant to him until she was gone. The 1920s were a decade of enormous productivity and complexity for Einstein. He continued working on quantum mechanics, contributing ideas that helped shape the field, even as he grew increasingly uncomfortable with where the field was going. He continued working on cosmology, applying his general relativity equations to the universe as a whole, which led him into one of the most famous blunders of his career. His equations initially predicted a universe that had to be either expanding or contracting. Einstein could not believe the universe was dynamically changing. He added a term to his equations, the cosmological constant, a kind of repulsive force that would keep the universe static. It was, he later called it, the greatest blunder of his life. Because Edwin Hubble's observations in 1929 would show that the universe was indeed expanding, just as the unmodified equations had implied. Einstein removed the cosmological constant from his equations, embarrassed. The irony, which he did not live to see fully, is that the cosmological constant turned out to represent something real. The dark energy that was discovered in 1998 to be driving the accelerating expansion of the universe is mathematically equivalent to Einstein's cosmological constant. The blunder was not as blundering as he thought. The 1920s were also the decade in which Einstein became deeply involved in political and humanitarian causes, and this engagement deserves some attention because it was not a sideshow to his scientific life. It was, for him, connected to the same values that drove his science. He was a pacifist from early adulthood. The First World War had horrified him. He had been in Berlin when the war started, and he watched colleagues and students he respected sign the Manifesto of the 93, a declaration by German intellectuals that defended German military action. He had refused to sign. He had instead signed a counter-declaration with very few other signatories, calling for an end to the war and for the creation of a European supranational authority. This put him at odds with the dominant intellectual culture of Germany, at a moment when to be a dissident was personally risky. He remained a pacifist through the 1920s, though he modified his views as the threats from fascism grew. He was deeply skeptical of nationalism of all kinds. He had renounced German citizenship in 1896, at the age of 16, partly to avoid military service. He later reacquired it almost by accident when German authorities classified him as German, regardless of his preferences. The relationship between Einstein and German national identity was always fraught. He used his fame deliberately as a platform for causes he believed in. He spoke about international governance, about the abolition of war, about the free movement of ideas. He was convinced that scientists, of all people, understood that the challenges humanity faced were technical and rational in nature, and that the solutions required the kind of clear thinking that science demanded. His politics made many colleagues uncomfortable. The consensus in academic culture was that scientists should stick to science. Einstein disagreed. He was also deeply aware of anti-Semitism, and it was growing. In the early 1920s, there were already organized campaigns against relativity as what some called Jewish physics. Physicists like Philipp Lenard and Johannes Stark actively promoted German physics against the abstract, Jewish physics of Einstein. Einstein found this absurd, and said so. But he also recognized its danger. He increased his involvement with Zionism, partly in response, seeing in the establishment of a Jewish homeland a practical answer to the statelessness and vulnerability of European Jews. He traveled to America in 1921 with Chaim Weizmann to raise funds for the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was the most famous Jewish person in the world, and he used that fame deliberately. The 1920s were also the decade in which Einstein was becoming increasingly isolated from the mainstream of theoretical physics, not because he was slowing down, but because the field was accelerating away from him in a direction he couldn't follow. The quantum revolution was building. Heisenberg, in 1925, had formulated matrix mechanics. Schrödinger, in 1926, had formulated wave mechanics. Born had given the probabilistic interpretation of the wave function. Dirac had unified the two approaches. Pauli had developed the exclusion principle. The Standard Model was being built, piece by piece, with extraordinary speed, and the theory worked. Its predictions matched experiments with a precision that was humbling. But the implications carried a price that Einstein could not pay. The Copenhagen interpretation, championed by Niels Bohr, said that physical quantities did not have definite values before they were measured. An electron did not have a definite position until something measured its position. The act of measurement created the definite value. Before measurement, there was only a wave function, a mathematical object that gave probabilities for different outcomes. Reality, at the quantum level, was genuinely probabilistic. Einstein could not accept this. His objections were not those of an old man unable to learn new tricks. He had helped invent quantum mechanics. He understood the mathematics. His objections were philosophical and, in his view, physical. He believed that a physical system must have definite properties independent of whether anyone was measuring it. The moon was there whether or not anyone was looking. An electron must be somewhere, even if we don't know where. Probability, in Einstein's view, reflected our ignorance of underlying variables, not the fundamental indeterminacy of nature. The debate with Bohr, which unfolded over years at conferences and in letters, is one of the great intellectual duels in the history of science. The two men respected each other deeply. They genuinely liked each other. Their arguments were serious and engaged with real care, and the arguments were, in the judgment of the physics community then and since, won by Bohr. Each of Einstein's increasingly clever thought experiments designed to show that quantum mechanics was incomplete was answered by Bohr with equal cleverness. Einstein would arrive at the Solvay Conference in Brussels with a new attack on quantum mechanics, having worked it out carefully during the train journey or the walk from his hotel. Bohr would listen, go away troubled, sometimes not sleep that night, and come back the next morning with the answer. The arguments were always good, and the answers were always adequate, and quantum mechanics kept standing. There are accounts from those who were present at the 1927 Solvay Conference, which brought together essentially every major physicist in the world in a Brussels hotel, of Einstein and Bohr walking together through the streets of Brussels in the early morning, still arguing, still pressing their cases to each other, their voices animated, their hands gesturing, two of the greatest minds in the history of physics locked in a conversation that neither could win or surrender. Paul Ehrenfest, the Austrian physicist who was a close friend of both and who was present at the 1927 Solvay Conference, wrote in a letter to his students that he was bewildered. He had been present at the debates, he said, and Einstein had seemed to him like a chess player who was checkmated again and again, and who nevertheless kept playing. It was, Ehrenfest wrote, with great love, one of the saddest and most moving things he had ever witnessed in science. Einstein kept pressing. His 1935 EPR paper, written with Podolsky and Rosen, was perhaps his most sophisticated attack on quantum mechanics. It argued that the theory was incomplete, that there must be elements of reality not captured by the wave function. The paper generated enormous discussion and eventually led, decades later, to Bell's theorem and the experimental tests that confirmed quantum mechanics and ruled out the kind of local hidden variables Einstein had in mind. He was wrong. But the question he was raising, what does quantum mechanics actually say about reality, is still not fully answered. In raising it so forcefully and so persistently, he forced the field to think more carefully about its own foundations. The world outside physics was darkening rapidly in these years. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. Einstein was in California when the news came through. He was visiting the California Institute of Technology, one of a series of American visits he had been making since 1930. When the news came, he immediately understood what it meant. He had been, for several years, a target of Nazi propaganda. His theory of relativity had been attacked as Jewish physics, as a perversion of good German science. He had received death threats. He had been publicly mocked. He knew immediately that there was no going back. He wrote to the Prussian Academy of Sciences, resigning his membership before they could expel him. He visited the German consulate in New York and renounced his German citizenship. He had been German, and then Swiss, and then German and Swiss, and now he would be neither. He found a position at the newly founded Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, an institution created with philanthropic funding specifically to give distinguished scientists a home free from teaching obligations. He moved there in October of 1933. He arrived in America speaking essentially no English, famous throughout the world, carrying everything he needed in a suitcase, 54 years old, starting over. He would live in Princeton for the remaining 22 years of his life. America was strange to him at first. He had visited before, in 1921, and again in 1930 and 1931, but those had been temporary visits, high-profile tours with lecture schedules and honorary degrees, and the whole apparatus of celebrity hospitality. Settling permanently was different. He spoke almost no English when he arrived in 1933. He had to learn it quickly, and he did, acquiring a workable, if heavily accented English within a couple of years. He made jokes about his accent and his struggles with the language. He was genuinely charmed by aspects of American culture, its informality, its lack of rigid social hierarchy, its willingness to let a European immigrant be himself without demanding that he conform to a particular mold. He found Princeton congenial, a pleasant university town with good walking and agreeable colleagues. He also found America's cult of celebrity simultaneously amusing and exhausting. He had been famous in Europe, but the American relationship with fame was different, more intense, more commercial, more insatiable. People wanted photographs. They wanted autographs. They waited outside his house. Department stores advertised that Einstein had been seen using their products. His face appeared on advertising materials. He found all of this mildly ridiculous and said so, though with more humor than anger. He had never attached his sense of self to the fame, and its American intensification did not threaten him. He settled into a routine. He walked to the institute in the mornings, often talking with colleagues or students along the way, discussing physics or politics or music, depending on who was walking with him. He worked in his office at the institute and in his study at home. He walked home for lunch. He napped. He worked in the afternoons. He played violin in the evenings, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. He received visitors and wrote letters. He attended the occasional lecture or concert. He continued, in Princeton, the same rhythm of solitary work and selective sociability that had defined his whole adult life. He felt, he said in various letters and interviews, genuinely free in America in a way he had not felt in Germany. Not just free from political threat, though that was real and important. Free in a deeper sense. Free to be eccentric. Free to be a foreigner. Free to walk around in old clothes without someone thinking it was a comment on the dignity of German physics. The institutional environment of the Institute for Advanced Study, with its complete absence of teaching obligations and its deliberately collegial culture, was exactly what he needed for the remaining work he wanted to do. The house at 112 Mercer Street, where he eventually settled after a year in rental accommodation, became one of the most famous addresses in American science. It was a modest white clapboard house on a tree-lined street in a pleasant university town, and it suited him perfectly. He walked to the institute every day, usually with his secretary Helen Dukas, who had come to work for him in Berlin in 1928, and had become, over the years, not just an employee, but a devoted manager of his life and legacy. She managed his correspondence, which ran to hundreds of letters a week. She filtered visitors. She made sure he ate lunch. She was, in many ways, the person who made the Princeton years possible, and she continued to manage his papers and his estate until her own death in 1982. Einstein's sister Maja came to live with him in Princeton in 1939, after fleeing Italy following the extension of German laws there. She was the sibling closest to him, his companion from childhood, and having her nearby was a genuine comfort. When Maja suffered a stroke in 1946 and was bedridden for the last years of her life, Einstein read to her every evening. He would sit beside her bed and read aloud, sometimes for hours. She died in 1951. The Princeton years were productive, but not in the way the earlier decades had been. Einstein continued to work, continued to think, continued to believe that a unified field theory was reachable. He published papers. He made arguments. He engaged with younger physicists who came to discuss their work. But the unified field theory eluded him, year after year, decade after decade. The approaches he tried did not lead where he hoped. The mathematics kept not working out. He remained convinced that the answer existed and that he was close. But close became a word that stretched to cover 20 years without resolution. He was also, in these years, writing and speaking on political and social questions with the same urgency that had marked his public engagement since the 1920s. He was a fierce opponent of McCarthyism, the anti-communist witch hunts that damaged careers and lives throughout American intellectual life in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He wrote letters defending people who had been targeted. He spoke at meetings. He signed declarations. He was, himself, under surveillance by the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover regarded Einstein with deep suspicion, convinced that his left-wing politics and his associations made him a potential security risk. There is a file on Einstein at the FBI running to nearly 2,000 pages, accumulated over 2 decades of surveillance. It reveals nothing more sinister than the activities of a politically engaged intellectual who believed in international cooperation and disliked nationalism. But Hoover kept watching. Einstein found this surveillance mildly absurd. He made jokes about it. He told friends that he had come to America for the freedom and had discovered he was being followed everywhere. He seemed to regard it as one of the costs of living in a country that was afraid of its own shadow, and he did not let it change his behavior. The atomic bomb haunted him. After the bombs fell on Japan, he wrote and spoke about the moral responsibility of scientists with a new urgency. He became a central figure in the effort to prevent nuclear war, lending his name to organizations and declarations, and appearing at conferences devoted to the question of how humanity was going to survive its own ingenuity. He helped found the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, which called for international control of nuclear weapons. He wrote repeatedly about the need for a world government that could enforce peace. His politics remained consistent with everything he had believed since his anti-war declaration in 1914. His pacifism was not naive. He had signed the letter to Roosevelt and understood the consequences. He was trying to find a way to live with those consequences, and with the larger reality that the weapons existed and would not unexist. His health declined in the early 1950s. He had survived a heart attack and had an abdominal aortic aneurysm that had been diagnosed and monitored. He knew his time was limited. He wrote to friends with an equanimity that reads as genuine. He had had his life. He had done his work. He was not afraid of dying, but he was not quite ready to stop working either. He was also, in these final years, thinking carefully about questions that went beyond physics in the usual sense. Questions about God, about the nature of religious feeling, about the relationship between science and the deepest human impulses toward meaning. He had been asked about religion throughout his life, in 1,000 interviews and letters, and he had given a variety of answers that were sometimes misquoted and misrepresented. He did not believe in a personal God, in a God who answered prayers, or intervened in human affairs, or cared whether any particular individual succeeded or failed. This was consistent throughout his life. He had gone through a brief period of intense religiosity in early adolescence and then abandoned it, and had never returned to Orthodox faith. But he did have a deeply felt sense of something he called cosmic religion, or the religious feeling. He described it as a sense of awe and reverence before the beauty and comprehensibility of the universe. He felt, when he looked at the equations that described physical reality, something like what a religious person might call the presence of God, a sense of astonishment that the universe should be this ordered, this susceptible to mathematical description, this beautiful. He found it impossible to believe that this order was accidental, and he had no patience for those who dismissed the question as unscientific. He said once that the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. Whoever does not know it and can no longer wonder, no longer marvel, is as good as dead. He was, in this sense, a profoundly religious man, even if what he was religious about was not what most people mean by religion. His God was Spinoza's God, the God of an ordered universe, the principle of rationality that seemed to underlie the whole enterprise of physics. This religious sensibility colored his response to quantum mechanics in ways that are worth understanding. His objection to the Copenhagen interpretation was not only philosophical, it was, at some level, theological. He could not believe that God played dice with the universe. He could not believe that the fundamental order he had spent his life describing was, at its deepest level, random and indeterminate. It felt, to him, like a betrayal of the very quality that had made the universe worth studying, and so he kept arguing, not because he was stubborn in a mindless way, but because the argument was, for him, connected to something he held more deeply than any specific position in the debate. The argument was about whether the universe was truly comprehensible, all the way down. He believed it was. He was still arguing for this when he died. In the early 1950s, he had been offered the presidency of Israel. Chaim Weizmann, the country's first president, and a man Einstein had known for decades, died in November of 1952, and the Israeli government asked Einstein to accept the presidency as Weizmann's successor. He declined. He was 73 years old and not in good health, and he said honestly that he lacked both the natural aptitude and the experience for dealing with people that the position required. He said he was a scientist, not a politician. He knew a little about nature, he said. He knew almost nothing about men. The offer and his refusal were widely reported, and many people found his refusal admirable. He had been involved with Zionism for decades, had spoken at fundraisers, had visited Palestine in the 1920s, had used his fame to raise support for Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which he had helped found. He cared about the establishment of a Jewish homeland, but he was also, throughout his life, uncomfortable with narrow nationalism of any kind. He had spoken, at various points, about the rights of Palestinian Arabs and about the need for coexistence. His Zionism was idealistic in ways that did not always fit the political realities of a newly founded state that was fighting for its survival. Declining the presidency was consistent with who he was. He was still working in April of 1955. The calculation on his bedside table, the unfinished attempt at a unified field theory, was not a formality. He had been working on it the day before he was taken to the hospital. He was working on it, in his mind at least, until the end. He died on April 18, 1955, at Princeton Hospital. He was 76 years old. His last words were in German. The nurse who was with him did not speak German. They were lost. His body was cremated, and his ashes scattered at an undisclosed location. He had asked for this specifically. He did not want a grave that could become a shrine. He did not want people making pilgrimages to a tomb. He had always been uncomfortable with reverence directed at himself, with the cult of personality that his fame had generated, and he was trying to resist it even in death. But the world did not comply. Einstein became, in death, even more of an icon than he had been in life. His face appeared on posters and T-shirts. His equations became symbols. His name became an adjective. To call someone an Einstein was to mean something everyone understood. His brain was taken from his body by the pathologist who performed the autopsy, without permission, and spent decades being studied and photographed and analyzed in a strange and undignified parallel biography that its owner would surely have found absurd. What did Einstein leave behind? The questions are easier than the inventory. He left behind special relativity, which reorganized our understanding of space, time, and motion. He left behind general relativity, which reorganized our understanding of gravity, and which underlies everything from GPS navigation to black hole physics, to our understanding of the evolution of the universe. He left behind the photoelectric effect explanation and the concept of the photon, foundational to all of modern optics and to quantum mechanics. He left behind the explanation of Brownian motion, which confirmed the atomic nature of matter. He left behind E equals mc squared, which underlies all of nuclear physics and all of cosmology. He left behind a cosmological constant that, added and then renounced, turns out to be perhaps the most important term in cosmology, representing the dark energy that drives the accelerating expansion of the universe. He left behind the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox, which launched the field of quantum information. He left behind Bose-Einstein statistics, which describe the behavior of a class of particles that bear his name. Let me say a little more about some of these legacies, because their reach is wider than most people appreciate. General relativity is not just a beautiful abstract theory. It is the foundation of modern cosmology, the study of the universe as a whole. The Big Bang Theory, our best account of how the universe began and evolved, is entirely built on Einstein's field equations. The expanding universe that Hubble discovered is described by those equations. The dark energy that was found in 1998 to be driving that expansion to accelerate is mathematically the cosmological constant that Einstein added and then removed and called his greatest blunder. Every modern cosmological observation, from the cosmic microwave background to the distribution of galaxies to the large-scale structure of the universe, is interpreted through the framework of general relativity. General relativity also underlies our understanding of black holes, which were a theoretical possibility in his equations from the very beginning. Einstein himself was ambivalent about black holes. He accepted that the mathematics allowed for them, but suspected some physical mechanism would prevent them from forming in practice. He was wrong about that. Black holes form, and they are now understood to be present at the centers of essentially all large galaxies, including our own. The image of the black hole in the galaxy M87, released in 2019 by the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration, was compared in real time to the predictions of general relativity, and the match was exact. A century after Einstein wrote down his equations, they were being confirmed by one of the most dramatic observations in astronomical history. GPS, which billions of people use every day to navigate, depends on general relativity. GPS satellites carry precise clocks, and those clocks must be corrected for two relativistic effects. Gravitational time dilation, the fact that clocks in weaker gravitational fields run faster, and velocity time dilation from special relativity, the fact that moving clocks run slower. Without these corrections, GPS would accumulate errors of several kilometers per day. It works precisely because Einstein's theories were correct. The photoelectric effect and the photon concept are foundational to laser technology, solar cells, digital cameras, optical fiber communications, and the entire semiconductor industry. Every photograph taken with a digital camera uses physics that Einstein worked out in 1905. Every solar panel on a rooftop, every data transmission over fiber optic cable, every LED light, all of it traces back to the photon. E equals mc squared describes every nuclear power plant, every nuclear weapon, every star in the universe. It describes the energy released in the thermonuclear reactions inside the sun and every star. It is perhaps the most consequential equation ever written in terms of its practical implications for how humans generate energy, wage war, and understand the cosmos. The EPR paradox that he published in 1935, which he intended as an argument against quantum mechanics, turned out to be a founding document of quantum information theory. The entanglement that Einstein pointed to as a problem has become the key resource for quantum cryptography and quantum computing. Quantum computers, which are being built in laboratories around the world right now, exploit the entanglement that Einstein found so disturbing. He was right that it was strange. He was wrong that it was a problem. He also left behind something harder to quantify, but equally important. He left behind a way of thinking about physics. He left behind the idea that the right approach to the deepest questions was not to accumulate more data, but to think more deeply. That the universe was comprehensible, that it operated according to principles that a human mind could grasp through sustained and careful thought. That elegant mathematics was a guide to physical truth. That simplicity, at the deepest level, was a sign of rightness. These intuitions have guided theoretical physics ever since, for better and for worse. Not all of them have been vindicated, His deep resistance to quantum mechanics, his insistence that there must be a classical reality underneath the probabilistic surface, has not been justified. His unified field theory has not been found, and the approaches he was pursuing are not considered promising by modern physicists. The problem he was working on when he died remains unsolved, though in forms he would not have recognized. But the incompleteness of his legacy doesn't diminish it. Every human legacy is incomplete. What he accomplished, what he contributed, what he saw that nobody else could see, is sufficient. More than sufficient. It's extraordinary. Let me slow all the way down now and let the story settle. You've traveled a long way tonight. From a quiet house in Munich in 1879, to a schoolboy with a compass who couldn't put his wonder aside, to a student in Aarau imagining himself riding alongside a beam of light, to a patent examiner writing 4 papers in a single year that nobody expected and that changed everything. From a professor spending 10 agonizing years building the mathematics of curved spacetime, to the November afternoon in 1915, when the equations finally came together and he couldn't sleep for 3 days. From the 1919 eclipse announcement and the sudden overwhelming fame, to the Solvay Conferences and the great debates with Bohr, to the arrival in Princeton in 1933 with a suitcase and a violin. From the signing of the letter to Roosevelt and the horror of Hiroshima, to the quiet walks through the streets of Princeton, to the unfinished calculation on the bedside table in April of 1955, and the German words that dissolved into the darkness of that hospital room and were never recovered. It's a strange life, a life of extraordinary isolation alongside extraordinary connection, a life of ideas pursued with almost inhuman concentration alongside very human failures of love and fatherhood and the compromises that ordinary life demands. He was not a saint. He was not uncomplicated. The first child he fathered, Lieserl, was given away and her fate is unknown. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him best, a difficult man to love, warm but often distant, generous in public but sometimes cold in private. His marriage to Mileva ended in pain. His son Eduard spent most of his adult life in a psychiatric institution, and Einstein saw him rarely after leaving Europe. These are not small things. But he was also capable of genuine warmth, genuine humor, genuine humility. He played violin simply because he enjoyed it, not for any audience, not to demonstrate anything. He wrote wonderfully warm letters to children who wrote to him, taking their questions seriously, answering with care. He walked through Princeton with exactly the same expression on his face, whether the day ahead held a conversation with a Nobel laureate or a trip to buy groceries. He was not performing. He was just himself, as consistently as any person manages to be. One of the things that strikes me most about his life is the quality of his relationship with wonder. The child who was unsettled by the compass needle never entirely grew up. He kept the capacity to be astonished, to encounter something and feel, not just note it intellectually, but actually feel that something about it was extraordinary and worth pressing on. Most people, as they age, lose this. The world becomes familiar. The compass needle is just a compass needle. Einstein never arrived at that acceptance. The needle was always pointing at something invisible. The beam of light was always outrunning his understanding. The equations were always slightly beyond what he had already written down. This is the deepest gift, if it can be called that. To keep finding things worth wondering about. To look at the ordinary physics of the universe, the way gravity bends light, the way mass curves space-time, the way a small amount of matter becomes an enormous amount of energy, and to feel, Not just to know, but to feel that this is not ordinary at all, that it is extraordinary, that it deserves sustained attention. He gave it that attention for 76 years. Think about that, gently, as your thoughts soften and your body settles. Consider what it means that wonder can be a life's work, that the feeling a 4-year-old has while watching a compass needle, that specific quality of astonishment at something invisible, doing something visible, that feeling can be the thread that runs through an entire life, through school and struggle and love and loss and war and fame and isolation and all the ordinary difficulties of being human. The wonder doesn't resolve, it compounds. Each answer opens onto the next question. The compass needle points to the electromagnetic field, and the electromagnetic field points to the relationship between electricity and magnetism, and that relationship points to the structure of light, and the structure of light points to the nature of time, and the nature of time points to the curvature of space-time, and the curvature of space-time points to the origin and structure of the universe, and so on, endlessly, each question bigger than the last, each answer more beautiful and more demanding than what came before. He followed that thread to the very end. Somewhere in Princeton, the house at 112 Mercer Street still stands. It's a private residence now, occupied by ordinary people who presumably know what happened there and perhaps feel, on certain quiet evenings, the faint weight of that history. The study where he worked is still there, behind its ordinary walls. The street outside is still lined with trees. His walks, from the house to the institute and back, trace routes through a town that has not changed dramatically in the 70 years since he walked them. If you walked those routes now, you would walk where he walked, breathe air over the same ground, pass under the same general canopy of sky. The Institute for Advanced Study still operates, still houses brilliant people, still functions on the principle that the deepest thinking requires freedom from teaching and from immediate practical application. It's his intellectual monument, more enduring than any statue. And everywhere, invisibly, the physics he understood is doing what it does. Space-time is curving around every mass in the universe. Photons are traveling at 300,000 kilometers per second, the same for every observer, just as he insisted they would be, even when the whole framework of classical physics said otherwise. E equals mc squared is operating in every star, in every nuclear reaction, in the very metabolism of your body, as it converts chemical energy to heat and motion. The universe is doing what Einstein understood it to be doing, quietly, persistently, without pausing to acknowledge the man who figured it out. That's the legacy, not the fame and not the photographs, and not the t-shirts with his face on them. The fact that when we look at the universe, we are looking at something that a mind understood, that a human being, in a particular time and place, asked the right questions, and held them long enough, and followed the mathematics, without flinching, and found something true. That's what he left. Everything else follows from that. There's something in that thought worth holding for a moment before you sleep. The universe was always the way it is. The geometry of space-time was always curving. Light was always traveling at the same speed for every observer. E always equaled mc squared from the very first instant of the Big Bang. These things were true before any human being existed to notice them. They will be true long after any human being exists to care. They are simply true, part of the fabric of the cosmos, independent of us. And yet we found them. A person sat in a room and thought carefully enough, and long enough, that some of those truths, yielded themselves to human understanding. That's not nothing. That's one of the most remarkable things that has ever happened. The universe, through a human mind, briefly understood itself, partially, incompletely, imperfectly, but genuinely. And that understanding changed how we live, how we navigate, how we generate energy, how we communicate, how we see the sky. Let that settle into you now, softly, like something you don't need to hold too tight. Rest now. Let the story settle into whatever part of your mind stores things worth keeping. The child with the compass, the student in Aarau, alive with the first clear sight of the question, the patent examiner's 4 miracle papers, the professor who shook for 3 days when he found his equations, the old man who declined surgery and died with a calculation unfinished, his last words in a language the nurse didn't speak, dissolving into the night. Albert Einstein, who asked the simplest possible questions and followed them wherever they led, without flinching, for 76 years. Who kept the wonder alive the whole way. Who proved, in the end, that the universe was comprehensible, and who never entirely believed his own proof was complete. And who played Mozart? Let's not forget that. Through all of it, through the Munich gymnasium and the patent office evenings and the 10 years of general relativity and the Nobel Prize and the celebrity and the exile and the Princeton walks, he played Mozart. He played because he loved it. He played because the sonatas had the same quality he was looking for in his equations, the same combination of simplicity and depth, the same sense that everything was exactly as it needed to be and could not have been otherwise. Music and physics were, for him, not 2 different things. They were 2 different approaches to the same underlying pattern. The universe had structure, and that structure was beautiful, and you could encounter it through mathematics or through Mozart, and either way you were touching something real. That's a thought worth carrying into sleep. Beauty as a guide to truth. Wonder as a life's work. Patience as the deepest form of intelligence. A needle pointing at an invisible field. A boy who never stopped asking what was moving it. The compass needle is still pointing where it always pointed. The field that moved it is still there, invisible, filling space, doing what it does regardless of whether anyone is paying attention. The geometry of space-time is still curving around every mass in the universe. Light is still moving at 300,000 kilometers per second, unchanged, the same for every observer, just as he said it would be. Let your breathing slow. Let the day dissolve. Let the equations be whatever they are. The geometry be whatever geometry does. The photons go where photons go. You don't have to understand it all tonight. You just have to let it be. The universe is comprehensible. One person proved it, and now it keeps being comprehensible, whether you're watching or not, whether you're awake or asleep, unfolding according to principles of elegant simplicity, in every direction, in every moment, all the way to the edge of what we can see and far beyond. Sleep well. The cosmos is exactly as Einstein found it. It will still be that way in the morning. It will still be that way long after the morning. It will always be that way. Rest well,